Okay, welcome to our first webinar. So good to have you all. I'm going to kick it off giving a little bit of background on us and She's Independent in the next few slides, but super excited to have you all today. Would love to hear feedback out of this. So please, let us know what you're thinking. You are going to be muted throughout this webinar, but if you have questions or feedback at any point, please send a note via the webinar chat or to my colleague Cassie at she'sindependent.com. Cassie will share some questions with me and we will get to those later on in this discussion. If you are not able to see my screen share, you can toggle in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. My video, you can swap them out. You should be able to see right now a screen that says negotiating up the ladder. So I'll give you just a second to make sure that you're set up correctly. In terms of sending questions, Cassie at she'sindependent.com will be standing by and feeding me some of those that we will address later on. So please feel free to ask anything you like. Great, so quick look at the agenda. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we'll be reviewing negotiating, what it means, why you should invest in this, and then we'll jump into some live Q&A at the end. I'm just hearing Sarah C. from Detroit is on the call. Feel free to let us know where you're calling in from. Happy to have you. Quick bio on me. My background is derivatives trading and enterprise sales and technology investing. I have a background successfully increasing compensation packages for both myself as well as friends and colleagues. One of my past roles had me in a position where I really wanted to negotiate up what I was making, and I was able to get an increase of 45%. And this was in a role that was notorious for underpaying. So definitely have some experience when it comes to those salary discussions. Let's spend just a minute talking about She's Independent. Super excited to be working on this business and this community. Who are we? We're a group really passionate about empowering women and really any individual who feels that they need to be empowered. So what do we look to empower? We really look to partner around personal, professional growth and development. We're looking to connect individuals across different generations. We think that mentorship, we think that inspiration is so important today. And we're really excited to do this through a mix of webinars, e-learning exercises, workshops, events. We just did rock climbing through a Denver community just last night here. And, we're also offering a really authentic and honest voice on our blog, which touches a lot of topics. If this sounds at all interesting, we'd love to hear from you. We are live with events in a few cities and constantly kind of thinking about what's next. So if you're interested, you live somewhere else, you want to get involved, feel free to reach out and we can have a conversation. Great. So why are we talking about negotiating? Why should you care? Maybe you're not in a role where you want to ask for more money tomorrow. Whether or not you realize it, negotiating is something that you have an opportunity to use in everyday life. Whether you're buying a car, purchasing a home, signing a lease for an apartment, you can always ask for things. You can often get the price down considerably with the right strategy. In this case, when we're talking about compensation, of course, we're trying to get that price up. In terms of compensation or in terms of salary negotiation, you're probably just thinking about a number. Something that we really want you to think about is there are many different aspects in terms of what you can negotiate around. It could be a title change, it could be a start date, maybe you like to take a lot of travel and you want to negotiate in some more PTO. It could be relocation expenses. So there's so many different things that you can use in a negotiation. Don't think of it as just the bottom line of what you're making every day. Finally, let's talk a little bit about that wage gap. It's something that you've probably heard a lot about in the news recently. It's something that we're pretty well aware of, us women on this call. We're earning roughly 78 cents per dollar of our male counterpart. If we address even the wider issue of diversity and race, it's going to be even bigger. We're super excited to have this conversation, address this really important topic, and talk about this because we really think that establishing yourself financially is something that's important in terms of both empowering yourself and being able to, figure out what you want in life. Why do we care about money? Why do we care about finances? We could talk about that one all day, but if you're financially independent, you really are able to decide what you want to invest in. And you're not necessarily going to be making decisions based on what somebody else says they want to pay for. So we're really strongly, in support of you establishing yourself financially. And I think the salary and the compensation that you're making in your job is going to be a big part of that. Okay, so let's start talking about salary negotiating and the different components, because this is something where if you break it down, we can get super strategic. So the components that we're going to talk about are confidence, information, and strategy and tactics. So first, let's kick it off with information. Have you done your homework? Do you know what you're worth if you went to another business? Do you have a pulse on the market? I think this is an area that a lot of people don't have a really good sense of, but in terms of being able to navigate, uncover, learn, where should you be spending your time and, what is your worth? Talk to recruiters. Recruiters probably reach out. If they don't proactively, you can find them. I think having a conversation and saying, hey, what are these other companies paying for this type of role? That's a great conversation to have. Additionally, we now have software sites such as Glassdoor, where they are going to tell you within an organization and within different types of roles, what you should expect in terms of pay. Next, let's talk about confidence. I think this is probably the most important piece and something that you're probably going to have to work the hardest to develop if it's an area that you're not comfortable with today. So my question to you is, do you truly believe that you are worth what you're asking for when you walk into that room? Do you know the dynamics going into the conversation? Because we're going to walk through some of those. And hopefully this will start to establish a bit of baseline confidence for that conversation. If you get to the stage of an offer, an employer is offering you a job, you should realize that in that position, they want to hire you. They do not want to lose you at this stage in the game. They've invested in finding you. They've invested in saying, hey, we're allocating budget towards this person. So that should make you feel confident that if you need to ask for more or if you need to ask for something different, you should be able to voice that. Hiring and onboarding are both pretty expensive investments for employers. So if you're already in a role, if you're looking to up-level your current salary, again, it all plays in. Make sure that you feel confident and make sure that you realize they want you in this role. So you can ask for things that are even maybe a little uncomfortable. What do you want to look like when you present yourself and when you show up in that room? I think that we've all heard dress for the job that you want, but dressing in a way that makes you feel comfortable and confident, that's great. So make sure that, you're wearing something you feel good about, put on that extra, piece of jewelry, whatever it is, whatever gives you confidence. I think that's something that we don't want to underestimate. Be positive. I think that especially when you're asking for things, you want to make sure you're reinforcing why does that employer want to work with you? And I think that you want to navigate it, a little carefully, because if you're too difficult, that may be a problem. But if you ask for something, you're confident, and you do it in such a way where you're reinforcing why they want to hire you, believe me, they're still going to want to hire you. And then the final piece I'd mention at this stage in confidence is make sure you practice. I don't know if you've ever realized ahead of speaking to a big audience or making a presentation, the real difference of laying out the different things you want to cover, taking the time to actually practice that conversation, maybe pulling a family member or a friend. This is something that can significantly increase the way that just the logic and the way that you come across, and you can really do it in a much more clean fashion. So definitely practice that conversation. Make sure that when you walk into that room, you're not going to freeze up. Know what you want to say. Finally, strategy. So there's a lot to talk about here. We're just going to start talking about the beginning of it, but I would say there's a much bigger conversation. So happy to go into more detail at a later event if that makes sense. Approach matters. Your strategy does matter. I have a picture of blackjack here on the screen. Poker face is a real thing. When you're playing with cards, what does this mean? You want to look confident. You don't want to give away things, via facial expressions. If you are scared or you're intimidated, all of that can come across in the way that you hold yourself. You may have heard of the term executive presence. Body language is a thing. So just by sitting in a certain way, right, you're going to look more confident or maybe less confident, but it's all something to think about and again, to practice. Something I like to point out is discomfort is okay. So it's not that, we expect after you go through a short seminar or even a workshop that you're not going to be uncomfortable, but just know that that's absolutely fine. Then finally, there are going to be some strategic things that you can employ, such as using silence to your advantage. When you ask for something, what do you do afterwards? I don't know if you've ever heard this, but having a sales background and a negotiating background, it's something really exciting and something that I love to do, which is when you ask for something, wait, pause. The first person that speaks, that's the person that, let's call it, loses. Meaning, if you ask for something, don't feel like you need to break into that silence. Wait for it. It's actually establishing that you are dominant and that you are able to handle that conversation and that you know your worth. A few other notes, before we get into those case studies. I think that a lot of people are surprised to find out that employers are typically planning for a negotiation. So you heard that right. They're probably setting money aside, assuming that a qualified candidate is going to ask for more. So if you don't ask for more, you're leaving something on the table. Few employers are going to be unable to negotiate. There may be a policy or a very strict, investor guideline in place. If that's the case, maybe they can't negotiate on your dollars, but maybe there are other things like PTO or start date or, something that will make you feel better. Maybe reporting line, maybe somebody you interviewed with, you didn't find them as impressive as his boss. Maybe you can report to his boss. Or her boss. So I think that's something that you want to think about, right? There are many things that are negotiable, and keep in mind that that employer is expecting to have a negotiation. Finally, one more note on strategy. In some states, it's actually now illegal to ask what you were making in your prior role. So why does this come into play? It was actually something enacted to say, great, let's make sure that we can level up these salaries, and let's make sure that people that are making, way less are able to negotiate or, get to the same playing field on a salary basis. So companies, and you want to check it state by state, but companies, if they're asking you, what do you make in your current role? That may not be something that you need to answer. A few ways they might ask it to get around that point is they may say, well, what do you expect to make in this role? I would say never be crazy, but if you were making 80 and you want to make 100 and they say, what do you expect to make in this role? Say 100, right? You don't have to say, oh, well, I was making 80 in my last, because you just volunteered that. So something to think about, for me, yes, I may actually volunteer what I was making in some situations. Why might I do that? Well, I'll tell you that when I went from a corporate role to a startup and realized that the startup couldn't pay me as well, I actually like to show them that the step down or the offer was one where I wanted to negotiate my equity up because of what I was giving up in terms of dollars. So there may be a reason you want to share that information, but just know that it's something that you can really handle in terms of the story and the positioning. And depending on what state you're in, you may not even have to share, what you were making in your last job. Next slide. Let's take a moment to take a few deep breaths, and we will center ourselves to make sure that we are focused and learning. So please take a few breaths. Great. So that was a short intentional break to make sure that you're engaged and you're viewing a beautiful oasis that I visited outside of San Francisco in that picture. Okay, on to the good stuff. So the first case study is going to be an exercise where you as a candidate are interviewing for a new role. Congratulations, that employer has offered you. They've offered $105,000, and in your last role you made $90,000. Looks great, right? You're excited, it's a step up, but here's our advice. Sleep on it. As with any big decision, it's a great idea to take some perspective and to come up with a game plan. In terms of the offer number, you should already have an idea in terms of the comp expectations throughout this process. As we suggested earlier, you want to do your digging, you want to know what your value is on the open market. So once you know what people are getting paid in that position, you don't want to go crazy, but it's absolutely fine to be expecting and wanting a step up from your last role, assuming that maybe there's a step up in deliverables, maybe it's a new title. You want to bake this in. Maybe this new company doesn't offer something like a 401k. Your prior company did, and that's worth something. So let's get to the bottom of that. Maybe your prior role subsidized healthcare costs that were $750 a month. That adds up, almost $10K a year. Maybe your prior company matched $7,500 a year in that 401k. So that could be a whole nother piece that you want to negotiate around. I'm not saying that if they don't have a 401k that that's something you can get into the employer, but it's something where you can negotiate and ask more in terms of your salary. Great. So in this scenario, let's just say that the new employer does not have a 401k. What are we going to do? The data points that we have are that you've determined you actually want $120,000 annually in this role. Why? You determined a $20,000 base was appropriate given increased responsibility. You also determined another $10K differential made sense given the lack of 401k. If you want to know what a 401k is, we can have that conversation as well. Now let's talk about the negotiation. We want to set the stage. We want to be direct and thoughtful. We want to make sure that you're value selling yourself throughout the conversation. In applying to past sales roles, one thing that I would typically do, which I would say employers kind of acknowledged and laughed about, is when I was asking for a lot in terms of an increase, I pointed out that in asking and in negotiating, I was demonstrating my sales skills, and they would agree. So why don't we try something like this? I'm responding to the HR person. Thanks so much for the offer. I'm really interested in this role, but in putting more thought in, in factoring in that there's no 401k, I'm really interested at $125,000. So taking a step back, we already said we were interested in 120, probably even 115, but let's just ask for 125. It's not crazy and it gives us some wiggle room. So maybe the recruiter comes back, this is going to be really tough. The most we've spoken about for this position is 110, maybe 115. Wow, they just went up 10K from the starting point, and you've only just begun. We're happy to offer more advice around this type of topic. There's a lot more that we can talk about, from negotiating and asking for a signing or relocation bonus. Again, it's not just the dollars that you're going to make annually in that role. You could get kickers based on performance. That's something that's pretty standard if you're in a revenue generating role. Negotiating around equity ownership is its own animal. Can definitely talk you through that, but I would say be careful, because just knowing about how many shares you're getting doesn't really mean anything. There's a whole discussion around, well, what's the ownership? What's the valuation? Again, we're happy to answer and address those types of questions. Want to leave you with one more thought before moving on to the next case study. When you're negotiating, be intentional. I already made this point, but I want to say it again. Don't be the first to talk when a question is lingering that you have put out there. If you ask for something, wait for the reply. Let the other person speak first. Hugely powerful when it comes to negotiating. Okay, on to our next case study. So in this one, you are looking for an increase in compensation within your existing employer. So a little different in terms of setup. You've consistently received positive feedback and increased responsibility, but you've not yet seen a substantial increase in pay. I hear this all the time. Okay, so let's walk through it. First, we want to have a plan. I want you to be able to speak to that increased responsibility. I want you to walk through and be able to highlight different successes that you've brought to that business. And I'm going to walk you through a few examples of these. Successes could be quantitative. I'm at 120% of quota. Nobody else on the team even hit 100%. Or qualitative. Our enterprise account Jackson Hole Management increased usage on the back of what I brought to them for our quarterly business planning, and we've now rolled out that strategy at our top 10 accounts. Quantitative is great. Qualitative is also great. You just want to be able to get words around, what did you bring and how did you help the bottom line? Or how did you help the culture? What have you done for that business? You want to be able to communicate that. Now, what's your ask? Understanding your value based on what the market pays in other businesses is helpful, but I also want you to think about this business and really what they could or what they should be paying you. Are you looking for a monetary increase? Maybe you're looking to move to management track. Maybe you want a title change. There are a lot of things that you can be asking for. I brought this up a little bit earlier, but I want to talk about it again, which is how important it is for a company to not lose an employee, whether they've made an offer or, even more importantly, if they already have a successful employee within the company. Employee retention is something that's extremely important for businesses, especially if they already know you're good in the role. I don't say this in the vein of asking for too much, but if you have a good relationship and if you're delivering in your role, then there is nothing wrong asking for more if you feel you are not being paid appropriately. Great. So on to the ask. At this stage, you have an idea of what you'd like. You make $107,000 today. You want to make $130,000. It's a substantial increase, but you've consistently added strategic value to the business, and you know that you're impacting the bottom line. What's next? How hard are you ready to negotiate? Before stepping into that room, I have a huge piece of advice. Get another offer. When you have another offer, you are truly ready to negotiate because you can walk away and it's going to come across in your confidence. It's going to come across in your strategy. You can tell them you have another offer. It's the best thing you can do. When you have the other offer, you are ready. So what does that look like? You want to set the stage for the meeting. Nobody likes to be caught off guard, so I highly recommend you let your manager know that you would like to sit down and discuss your compensation. The meeting may happen same day. It may happen in 2 weeks. That individual may have to find out what does budget look like, or just review, what has been your review feedback? What do other people think about working with you? I would say good luck at this stage, but in truth, you make your own luck. So we'll move on from here. So in recapping from those exercises and walking through those components, ask yourself, are you ready? Are you ready to walk away? Do you have a backup? What happens if you don't get it? How confident are you in that ask? Do you feel that you're truly worth what you're asking for? It will come across. And then a really important piece here is, are you able to handle rejection? Because rejection is something that sometimes happens. And I really like to point out here, failure is fine. Failure is actually great. It means you're learning. If you never hear no, you're not pushing boundaries and you're not asking for enough. So I'm a huge fan, and we actually spoke about this at our rock climbing event last night. If you want to get better, you're going to have to fail sometimes. And that means asking for things and hearing, well, no, I can't do that today. Maybe I can't pay that today, or we need to see these other things first. There's nothing wrong with getting a no. I would actually say the only thing that's wrong is if you never hear no because you're not asking for enough. Great. So that was kind of the bulk of the exercises. In terms of what we offer, at She's Independent, we'd love it if you joined our community. We can get a little bit more interactive in terms of, the learning and the growing. We will have exercises that we circulate on a weekly basis. So we'll have a few out of this webinar today. We have things like workshops, one-on-one coaching. If you don't want to pay out of pocket, we're happy to work with corporate. So feel free to introduce us to your team, and we can be there in terms of mentorship, in terms of inspiration, you name it. We'd love to hear from you. One other thing I would mention maybe before I move on, if you are part of that premium community, we will be responsive via email. So if you say, hey, Natalie, here's my situation with the negotiation, or this is what I want to ask for, or like, here's my equity offer. Can you walk me through valuation? What would you do? That's something that we're happy to do for the premium community members. Awesome. So I'm hoping you learned something today. Please share us. The more support that we have and the more people in our community, the more that we can bring to you in terms of value. So really excited to have you all on, and really looking forward to some feedback. In terms of our next up webinar, on November 20th, we're going to be partnered with a local investor, myself, who's done some investing, and then probably another investor out of New York or London or San Francisco. And we're going to walk through, what is tech investing? It's not for everybody, but it's something fun. It's something that if you want to get involved, we can talk about it. We can walk through the basic logistics of it. Future webinars, that we're looking at, or events, workplace culture, mindfulness, dressing for confidence and success, an introduction to real estate investing. So we have a lot coming up that we're really excited about. And now on to some Q&A. So please email Cassie if you haven't, and I will walk through some of these questions. Okay, so let's see. One of the questions that I see is, what is the toughest negotiation I've gone through? And that's a tough one. Let's see. I've gone through a lot. I think the toughest negotiation for me, and I'm trying to think of a specific time, but it's when I really want something. I think that when you are leaving something on the table, when you can't walk away, right, you're not in the best position to negotiate. So if I don't have a backup offer, or if I'm so mission aligned and so passionate about that business, it's really tough to negotiate as hard. So I think that's kind of a more general answer, but I would say throughout my career, if I'm really excited and enthusiastic, it definitely impacts my negotiating style. I would still say I feel pretty good about where I've been and what I've accomplished there, but that's something that materially does impact me. Okay. I have another one that says, how often should you ask for a raise? And let me actually quickly pull up that screen of, Cassie's email. So you can email Cassie at shesindependent.com if you have any questions. So the question of how often should you ask for a raise? I mean, listen, I think that it's going to be company specific somewhat, because some companies maybe have policies in place. But I think that if you are getting increased responsibility, I would always want to see some type of increase, whether it's a title, I want to see a salary increase, I want to see a bonus increase, anytime that you get a step up in terms of what your role is. I also think that annual is not unexpected or unheard of, and actually is pretty normal. So I've heard of friends that only get a few $100s, around the holidays, when I was making tens of thousands of more, given I was working in a financial profession. So it's also industry specific. But you really should, if you're adding value, you should be getting some type of raise year over year, or at least bonus if the business is really cash strapped. I think that some of those startups that are really lean, it may be more of an equity bonus than a cash bonus, and that's fine, but you want to feel appreciated, and you want to make sure that, you're aligned in terms of your growth within that role. Okay. One more question is, when should you disclose the salary that you're looking at when you're going through the initial recruiting process? So I think this is one where you want to have some type of expectation in place. I think that you want to be careful to not over ask, but you want to make sure that you're setting the stage and you're not completely off. A lot of times companies will give you a range or give you an idea of what they're going to pay, but it is a good idea to establish at least ballpark, what are you looking to pay in this role? You don't have to put out the number that you need, because I think that's later when you actually get to the point where they've offered you. But you want to make sure that ballpark you're somewhat aligned. So I think that having that conversation early on to say, well, what is this role? And HR really should be opening up and telling you a bit of expectation or ballpark for the comp. You should at least have some idea that it's within the range of where they are. What do I mean within the range? If you're looking for 200 and they're at 120, that's really tough. If you're looking for 200 and they say 150, hey, you know what? Maybe you have a little bit of room there. It's going to be a little harder, but I would just make sure that it's not something like you're 100% off in terms of what you're looking for. I do want to mention, because I know, Kristen, you just said the chat is disabled. You can email Cassie at she'sindependent.com. Apologies, I think that based on the settings, some people are not able to ask questions via the chat right now. Okay, next question. Should you consider startup companies' growth period when asking for a raise? And this question specifically says the company became operational in March 2018. So I have a ton of thoughts around, growth tech and companies. I would say a few things. First, what does their funding look like, right? Are they bootstrapped, meaning are they self-funded? Have they raised significant capital with investors? The reason I ask that, and I think there's a ton of questions to ask there, is what can they do, right? When you have investors, when they've given you a lot of capital, they're also going to take up a bunch of ownership in that business. And so maybe there's going to be less flexibility of giving out more equity. If it's bootstrapped and you haven't raised capital, like me at She's Independent, I think that's one where you can be more aligned via equity incentives. I think that you also need to be careful or be aware that, especially for earlier stage growth businesses, if they're not if they're not flush with cash, if they're not profitable, if they're spending money, it's going to be that much harder for them to pay you in cash. So I think being aligned and being able to work with them around some type of equity compensation package, and not just trying to get cash, is really a great way to kind of align. March 2018, it's not that long ago. So I'm guessing that they probably, are not in a position to do a ton with cash. That being said, let's say you're in a revenue generating role, then you could absolutely negotiate in things like, okay, well, if I'm helping close business or if I'm helping grow business, I want these types of kickers, and that can be cash. So I think there's a few ways to think about it. Happy to dive into that in more detail, later on. And then another question was, how do you find a baseline or comparable salary if your position is in a relatively new industry? I think that, finding and exploring in terms of maybe there aren't a lot of businesses doing what you do, or roles, that are comparable to yours. I think it's great to have those conversations with recruiters for that reason. There's no reason why you can't look at your skill set and background and just think about, well, what can I make in another industry, in a role that maybe is a completely different title, but somebody with my skills, what are they getting paid? It's obviously much tougher if you're like going from finance to startups, but I do think that there's definitely a like for like comparison there, such that, you can get at least an idea of the ballpark of, what are you worth? Again, I think that there's equity and there's other things that you can think about that's not just about cash. But even if it's a relatively new industry, having conversations with whether it's, maybe colleagues or, people like us, mentors, consultants, or again, just speaking to recruiters, really should give you a pulse on the market. Okay, a few more questions. Are you in a better place to negotiate for a raise at your current job if you're at a small or large company? Wondering if you've run into issues working at larger, more bureaucratic companies. So I would point out the thing or the topic I brought up earlier, which is I actually was able to get a substantial 45% pay increase at an existing position. And it was a company that notoriously underpaid. It was a big company. I would say they made billions of dollars top line and, tens of thousands of employees. And how was I able to do this? I walked into that room. I was ready to leave. I had an offer away and I didn't want to stay. So when do you get a 45% pay increase? It's when you don't need it, right? It's when you're not asking for it. In terms of better place to negotiate, I think a lot of it is, what have you demonstrated and what was your success? I was the sales leader or one of the top sales leaders within the organization, and it was a big growth organization. So for me, I understand the value that I brought, and I was able to ask for something that I thought would be ridiculous for them, and they actually met me. But yeah, I think that big or small, I think part of it's going to be the culture. I think part of it's going to be what have you demonstrated in terms of value. I think if it's a really small and really lean team, on one hand, you have a lot of leverage. They don't want to lose you. But again, on the other hand, you don't want to come off as you're going to leave them and they're going to be in a bad situation without you. So I don't know if it's so much size of company. I would say, what is the value you're bringing? Can they pay you, right? Do they have the cash? Sometimes large companies will just have more cash. So I think it's really going to be specific, but I guess the approach and the strategy, no matter where I am, small or large company, I would still want to back up offer. I would still want to do all my research. I'd probably approach it pretty similarly. But I do think that large companies, are able to just probably do more because of the cash that they have. And then any additional tips for asking for a raise if you don't have another offer in your current role? First, I would say get another offer. I realize it takes some investment, but you're going to learn in that process, right? Whether you're expanding your network, whether you're getting a pulse on what is the value that you should be garnering. I think that it's just a good exercise to do. If you don't have another offer, there are definitely things that you can do. Be extremely well-versed, extremely confident going into the conversation and knowing what you've brought in terms of value. I would say in some cases, I did ask for raises when I didn't have a backup offer, but I wasn't ready to walk away. So that's the difference. If you're ready to walk away, it's going to come across in terms of the confidence, in terms of, you actually saying, no, like I'm only taking the 30%, or the another 30K. I'm not saying otherwise. It's a different conversation. I would just say, make sure you feel really confident in what you're asking for and make sure you can walk through why you're worth that and why you're asking for that increase. Okay. Any more questions? It's approaching the hour, I guess, and I don't want to keep you all. I know it's a work day, but I really hope that, you learned something and you enjoyed today's discussion. I will send out a recording of everything that we went over, and I will pull up this slide one more time. If you are interested in joining the community, 50% off for your first month. And we would love to be in touch and, answer your questions and continue to be inspired by the people that join. Awesome. Well, thanks again and talk to you all soon.